welcome back to Media Reporter. My name is Lauren Whiting, and I'm a 3L law student at New York Law School. And we are continuing our conversation with Professor Robert Blecker, who is a leading advocate for the death penalty. Thank you for coming back and joining us.
My pleasure.
He is just releasing a new Kindle single on Amazon.com that you can download right now. It is called Let the Great Axe Fall, and I had the pleasure of reading it before it was released to be able to discuss these memoirs, the memoir with him. And I have to tell you, I loved it. It grabbed me and I thoroughly enjoyed it. Now, granted, I am a law student and I have taken criminal law, but I thought it was a great perspective on anything I could like and anything I could hate about the death penalty. And I thought it was a great way to tell this story through you and your experiences.
Well, thank you.
So thank you. So to catch you up, last week we started out the first half of what was going on in the memoirs and Leech Rock and a few other stories about what Professor Blecker has experienced. And last we spoke, I asked you, was there anything that could make you act in a fashion that could possibly get you on death row? And I think we started off talking about the hired killer, and that your claim is that he is the worst of the worst. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yes. One of the great mistakes we make of the death penalty is that we fashion it too broadly and too narrowly in certain respects. That is, it covers people who don't deserve to die and fails to cover some who do. It's too broad and too narrow. And as a retributivist, I'm just as committed to making sure that we don't punish those who don't deserve it as I am that we do punish those who do.
Okay, and Can you tell me what a retributivist is exactly?
Yes. Someone who believes in retribution believes that the past counts independently of future benefits. It counts, that we actually make covenants and are obliged to keep them. We make covenants with the past. We make covenants with the dead. Now that may strike many people hearing it as irrational. What do you mean you make covenants with the dead? The dead are dead. Why cry over spilled blood? I mean, the past is the past. You can't change it. So why dwell in it? And the perspective is not strictly rational, but it's real. And the universe of reality and justice is incommensurably richer than the strictly rational and legal.
It sounds like you're saying there's a place for emotion in law.
Oh, there is a deep place and a vital place for emotion in law. It's impossible to eliminate it, even though the United States Supreme Court tries, and many law professors
have tried. With the first indication that ethics is not morality.
And even Aristotle, you remember the movie Legally Blonde?
Yes.
And remember the quote on the blackboard, and the class is asked,
malum prohibitum versus malum per se?
No, although that comes from Aristotle also. And that's on point here in terms of our discussion. Things that are bad because they're prohibited versus things that are bad in and of themselves. I'm one that holds that certain acts, certain crimes are so vicious that some people deserve to die. And that there is an objective truth to this, that we classify murder as an A felony and attach either life in prison or death to it, and we classify petty larceny as a misdemeanor and attach a very brief punishment, if at all, to it. Now, one could argue that what makes murder more serious than petty theft is that we punish it more harshly, and that's all that you can say about it. But my response is that the reason that we punish murder more harshly than petty theft is because the crime is worse. It's not worse because we punish it more severely. We punish it more severely because it's worse. There is a moral fact of the matter. Some crimes are objectively worse than others. Some criminals are objectively more evil than others. Some people deserve more and worse punishment than other people deserve. So the retributivist is not strictly rational, is not part of the cost-benefit set. Those are the utilitarians.
The utilitarian, right, you mentioned.
In which you use punishment as a means to other ends, to deter others, to incapacitate, maybe even to rehabilitate. For the retributivist, you punish because some people deserve it. And that's why, because the past counts. Because we make a covenant with the dead. I mean, there are examples throughout there that I became aware of in different times of my life. You might remember when I was coming off a fellowship year at Harvard as a fellow in law and humanities, Rudolf Hess had broken out into the public attention again. Hess was Adolf Hitler's deputy Führer.
Right.
And at Nuremberg, he had bailed out over Scotland in 1941 on an aborted peace mission to somehow convince the Brits to dump Churchill and make peace with Hitler.
Right, and he's being held in
Germany, in Spandau prison.
Okay.
In a prison that's administered by the four powers. And this is part of the agreement after World War II. Right, yeah. The Russians, the French, the British, and the Americans are going to administer Spandau prison. And it held some of the ranking Nazi war criminals who were not executed. Some were hanged. The next level were sent to Spandau for life. By the time 1977 rolls around, Rudolf Hess is 83 years old, in ill health, and is the only one left in Spandau. Everybody else has either died or been released. So they are keeping a prison open for one prisoner. The utilitarians are saying, how ridiculous is that?
I think it was mentioned that it was $300,000 a year
correct.
to keep him.
That's correct.
And even then, he's able to go and take walks in a garden.
Well,
and
limited up to that point.
Okay, up to that point.
And so what happened was that there's this cry, this public cry, free Rudolf Hess, free Rudolf Hess. And the Americans called for his freedom. The former warden called for his freedom and wrote a letter to Jimmy Carter, and as a Christian he should be forgiven and freed, allowed to die a free man. The Brits favored freeing him. The French favored freeing him. There was only one holdout, and that was the Soviets. And I found myself oddly agreeing with the Soviet Union for the first and only time, I think, in my memory against the position of the United States government. And the Soviet Union, the position of the Soviet Union was, we cannot forget the past. We cannot forget the blood. Now, at Nuremberg, Hess announced that he was proud to have served the greatest son of Germany, and that if he had it to do again, he wouldn't change a thing. So, my view was it was critically important that Hess never be freed, that he die in prison, because the past counts. Because we made a covenant with the 6 million dead, that we would not forget, that we would not forgive, that we would not ask ourselves the question, what good will this do? We would not ask ourselves the question, is this too expensive? Which, of course, is a favorite question of opponents of the death penalty. Look at how expensive it is. Look at how much we're paying.
I find that such an ironic argument, because when it's this emotional, almost moral argument that the death penalty is wrong, we should not be killing someone, and their justification is a pecuniary interest.
Well, yes,
it just doesn't sit well with me that they want to paint themselves as someone righteous, and their argument is pecuniary.
Which then brings us back to your initial question, which is hiring the hitman, the pecuniary interest involved in killing.
Detract from your goal?
One of the worst types of killers, who most clearly deserves to die, is the hitman, the assassin, the hired killer. He, after all, will kill anybody.
And what about the person
price.
that hires him?
Well, that's the story that you're talking about. When they turned on me, I had probed some of the guys I was closest to. The inmates, yes. I had probed some of the guys I was closest with. Itchy, who you may recall at one point saved my life, who was brilliant, absolutely brilliant, and who by the time I met him was this vital, vibrant, constructive presence who was spending his life making sure that kids didn't make his mistake. He started a program called Take It From Me inside the prison, where they would bring kids in from the inner city, and they would give it to him straight. It's like Scared Straight, which ironically he was the grandfather of, because when he was in the Atlanta penitentiary, he started the second NAACP chapter in any prison, and started this program for at-risk youth in Atlanta. And guys in his program who served under him later went to Rahway Prison in New Jersey and then started the Scared Straight program, about which they made a movie. So Itchy was actually the grandfather of Scared Straight. Anyway, when I met him, he was this vital, constructive presence who was both the boxing coach and the law librarian, who insisted that every kid who was on the boxing team be involved in his case. If you didn't know some law, if you didn't study law, he'd suspend you from the team until you got involved in your own case. You had to learn some law and be involved.
You know, one thing that I noticed about Itchy in here was this almost righteous individualism that he said, even when we talked about his code last week, where it's on you. You brought that witness into this, it's on you if that witness saw you commit your crime. And I find myself empathizing with Itchy and some of the other inmates that you discussed things with at Lorton, and it was kind of an odd moment for me to realize that I could
Yes, it does that to
identify.
you, and that they're humans. And yes, and part of Itchy's code in terms of the hired killer. I asked him about that, and he told me a story that someone had, a woman had once tried to hire him to kill a guy. He said, you know, they assume if you'll do some things, you'll do anything.
Right.
He said, but it turns out that I knew the guy, said Itchy. I happen to know the guy, and this woman was messing with another guy, had a boyfriend, and she could see the money from having him killed that she would get.
Was it a husband and life
Yes.
insurance? Okay.
And he said, you know, I wasn't going to do that. I could kill somebody, and he had plenty. I mean, the Itchy that I saw in his 50s was this vital, vibrant, humane, rich, emotionally rich human being. The Itchy I never knew at 19 years old had shot 57 people. And when I asked him, how many did you kill? He said, I never stayed around long enough to find out. That's not the Itchy that I knew, but that's a real Itchy too. And the question is, do you keep the covenant with the past? That
The
gets
prior
us
Itchy,
That's
is the
correct.
Itchy that we have
And
today
we're-
the same person that we're actually punishing? And
Right, and we can talk. I mean, that came to light. I mean, again, is the Rudolf Hess that at 83, going blind and struck with arthritis? Is that the same person as Hitler's deputy Führer? Was Carla Faye Tucker?
he was on death row in Texas, right?
In Texas, yes. And she was the pickaxe murderer. At one point, she had taken a pickaxe and ripped the flesh out of her victim and admitted to feeling deep sexual satisfaction each time she gouged flesh out from him. And then there was a younger woman lying in bed terrified as a witness, and she pickaxed her to death and left the axe embedded in her. By the time they were ready to execute Carla Faye Tucker in 1998, I believe, she had become a born-again Christian, or at least she said it, and most of the world believed her, including me. And one of the reasons that we believed her, were so ready to believe her, wanted to believe her, right, was that she was very pretty. She was a babe. And we have this deep association in this and probably every culture of beauty with goodness. And so there was this huge outcry about don't execute Carla Faye, don't execute Carla Faye. And it was a worldwide outcry. And I was invited on, I don't remember, some show, I think it was CNN. And I said that we're killing the wrong person if we execute Carla Faye. We're getting the right body, but she's escaped. It's a different person by now. And I felt this unaccustomed warmth and fuzziness from the interviewer, who thought I was this proponent of the death penalty. And I was unaccustomed to such warmth. And I added, so the lesson for me is we should have killed her quickly before she had a chance to...
Just to put that space back.
Before she had a chance to transform, so that we would have been killing the right person in the right body.
Right.
So the Itchy that I got to know in his 50s was a different Itchy by the time I got to know him, who probably, almost certainly did deserve to die. He even conceded it to me one night in a trailer right before the rooster crowed after an all-night session that we had, and we get all greasy. I mean, you know, just one-on-one, no guards, in a trailer, and we talk all night. And he, out of the blue, conceded to me that he did deserve to die for what he had done. But anyway, Itchy was talking, so we're talking about the hitman, the hired killer, and somebody approached Itchy, this woman approached Itchy to kill her husband. And Itchy happened to know the guy. And he went and he told him. Now, that's a violation of Itchy's code because you never snitch. But he acknowledged this one as an exception because he knew that this guy wouldn't go to the police with that one. So he went to the guy, telling him that his wife was trying to get him killed, and had approached him, waiting to see what the guy was going to do. And the guy went back and told her. He didn't believe him. He didn't believe Itchy. No, you're wrong. She would never do that. And he said, as Itchy said, a lot of guys go to their death believing that. And he went and he told her. Now that created a real problem for Itchy, because now he figures if she's cold enough to kill her husband, she's probably cold enough to have him killed too. So now he's got a problem, and she's got a problem. So he considered killing her. And the guy would have none of it.
She would only be
Well,
I mean,
if she could have him killed. If she's
but
cold enough to approach him to kill her husband, she's cold enough to approach somebody else to have him killed.
but doesn't that bring us back to, I want to say it was Leo that says she doesn't hurt him now, but she might hurt him in the future?
Well, but
I guess this is all sort of a violation of his code regardless, but.
So he suggested to the guy that he could take care of it. And the guy said, no, 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 because he loved this woman. No, no.
Despite.
So in the end, he paid Itchy $6,000 to make it go away. And Itchy chuckled with the irony of it. He said, when you think about it, she approaches me and offers to pay me to kill him, and he ends up paying me not to kill her. So there's that topsy-turvy irony in life. But at one point, Johnny turned to me, Johnny Allen, the guy who started me on this. And after I had condemned the hitman, and we were interviewing another guy, young Rob, his name was, whom Johnny had a lot of respect for, one of the unusual young drug dealers with principle, who, well, principles, some of which I found repulsive, but had principles. In any case, I expected Rob, young Rob, who had killed several people in his time, but they were people who robbed his dealers. And he explained to me how you can't deal drugs and not retaliate when someone, he was a supervisor, he was a lieutenant. You can't be a lieutenant and not retaliate when someone rips off your runners, because then they'll take it. As soon as you get it on the street, it's gone. So you just can't, either you don't deal drugs or you got to be prepared to do what you got to do. So I thought he would condemn the hired killer, because the hired killer, he would only kill on principle, but the hired killer would kill anyone you pay to have killed. And he wouldn't. And he said, no, you know, it's a hustle like any other. It's all the same. You know, you do your thing and he does his thing. And then I said, you don't think we should kill him? Execute the hired killers? And he said, no. And then I switched into a utilitarian mode of speaking, which isn't what I really believe. I said, but why should we pay to keep him alive? And that stumped him. And he said, that's a good question. Now, Johnny didn't like that young Rob was stumped, that I was showing him up. So Johnny, who patiently sat there in his wheelchair hour after hour, day after day after day, and was the silent presence, but was very useful, because after we'd interview a guy, every once in a while when he had a sense that a guy was lying, if some people did, he'd say, wait a minute, and then he'd confront him on it. Or afterwards he'd say, I didn't believe this, this, and the other thing. So he was very useful. But this time Johnny uncharacteristically broke in and said, I don't mean to interrupt your train of thought, Rob, this Rob, Slim Rob. Right. But I got to ask you a question. Bad, isn't it? Is there anything anybody could do to you that would make you want to kill him? Or your family that would make you want to kill him? And the deal we had was tell the truth to each other. Honesty. And the truth is, and I acknowledged it, if anybody raped and murdered my mother, my wife, my child, would I want to kill him? Yeah, I would. Could I kill him? Yeah, probably. And then he said, well, what about, suppose you couldn't?
You couldn't get to them?
You couldn't get to them.
Then what?
Then what?
Then your angel of mercy, hitman.
But that's the guy that you just said should be killed, the same guy that you're implying that you would go to. And he tied me right up in knots. And my moral gyroscope was wobbling, and watching this tongue-tied law professor gave them more pleasure even than my students get when they watch me. And they just broke out laughing. And then Johnny said, you don't have to worry, Rob, because if it ever comes up, I can get it done for nothing. It won't cost you anything. So that ended that. There were times when on the train back home from New York, from Washington, D.C. to New York, I'd wonder whether my moral gyroscope really was still spinning and keeping track of north. I'd wonder whether I could really make the distinctions that I claimed we could and should be making between those who deserve to die and those who don't.
You mentioned also in your memoir, and I feel like this is sort of an analogy for even what you're saying, is this theoretical game versus could you go through with it, could you do it, of a sport. And I think you use the game and sport analogy for what law is and how it just applies. You know, if it's a game of chess. Once the decision for the move is made, the move is made. It's synonymous. And the argument is that then sport is when you've arrested somebody, what goes on? So I think some of the people that you spoke with, they'd pled down or they hadn't actually dealt with the punishment for their actual crime. How do you argue that? I mean, how do you deal with the fact that there is someone out there that's doing these horrible things, and they've pled down to rat on somebody else, and this individual deserves the death penalty under your retributivist ideals?
Okay, good. Let's go back to the basic distinction. As I define that distinction, and game and sport plays an enormous role, a significant role in the piece and an enormous role in my life. I've been developing a philosophy of game and sport, and that was my law school thesis, etc. As I define it, you're quite right. The difference between a game and a sport essentially consists in the fact that in a game, the move that you choose is the move that you make. The greatest chess player could be paralyzed. Other people could move her or his pieces, and it wouldn't matter. The greatness would still be there at the choice of move. A sport, you've got to actually perform it. You've got to execute it. It's one thing to see the pass that needs to be made, the pitch that needs to be thrown, the whatever it is, the shot, the block. It's another thing to do it.
With the defense coming at you.
You actually got to do it.
Down.
You got to make the move. And the move that's actually made is never exactly the move that's chosen. And every athlete knows that. And it's one thing to have the architect's plans. It's another thing as the construction crew to deal with the facts on the ground. The house is never quite built exactly the way the architect's plans see it. The piece is never quite played the way the composer envisions it. So the real world interferes between the choice of the move and the successful execution of the move. It approaches, but never actually achieves its full game-like status. And I don't mean by game anything light, and that connotation is not there. Now, in the death penalty context, we have these moves that we choose. We have these categories that we draw between the worst of the worst of the worst who deserve to die and the next most bad set who may deserve a life in prison but not to die. We have defenses. We have mitigating circumstances. Could be age, youth, relative youth. It could be child abuse.
Mental disease or defect.
Correct. Mental retardation. It could be all these things that either categorically exempt people from the death penalty or operate as a weight for mercy.
Okay.
Now, the game that we design will never actually be perfectly executed, which is what you pointed out. For any of a host of reasons, there will be people who deserve to die who will not get the death penalty. The game will not be played out because they will plead, because the prosecutor doesn't have the resources to pursue it, because a jury will nullify and not convict. I mean, if anyone who thinks that O.J. Simpson wasn't guilty, I have investment opportunities and a bridge to sell you. So the point is that the best sometimes becomes the enemy of the good. That is the perfect, and I draw from my experience with Bobby Fischer, the great and later vile, but in his time when I spent 2 days with him, the greatest, perhaps the greatest chess player ever to live. And that is that the search for the perfect move can sometimes foreclose the making of a very good move. The fact that there are going to be people who deserve to die and won't be killed is troubling. And it undermines the perfection of the system. But the system isn't perfect. Now, of course, the even more troubling prospect is that we might be killing people who don't deserve to die. And I'm not just talking about the factually innocent. We probably have executed somebody in the modern era. I know that's not popular among death penalty proponents. I believe we have. We don't know who it is. It hasn't yet been demonstrated. Even opponents to the death penalty admit that we have not conclusively, demonstrably proven that we've executed a factually innocent person. But my focus is on people that we've executed who were guilty of murder, but were not the worst of the worst of the worst. They didn't deserve to die for it. And there, the sport screws it up also. Ambitious prosecutors, eyewitness testimony shaded, a jury that's particularly vulnerable to or particularly predisposed to detest one kind of killing versus another, so that...
Or even the sneaky abolitionist juror that feigns non-prejudice, because it only takes one abolitionist, but it takes 12.
In most states, that's correct. There are some states that allow for a majority jury verdict, or a 9-3 to execute.
In the sentencing phase. Okay.
In the sentencing phase. Most jurisdictions require a unanimous jury condemnation before you get in. So you're quite right. It just takes one juror, one stealth juror, who passes by the jury selection process and says, yes, in the appropriate set of circumstances, I could find death, who in fact would never find death. Could never, would never, will never. And so you get an 11-1 jury verdict for death, and the one holdout will make it life in most jurisdictions. Now, there's an example in which the game as designed doesn't get played out in the sport as executed. The move chosen is not really the move executed. It's chosen by 11/12ths of the jury. It was chosen by the legislature who designed the death penalty statute to make this kind of killing death eligible, and yet it won't be executed. Because we don't do it perfectly doesn't mean that we aren't obliged to keep trying. The question is, what is the more just alternative? A life without parole only, where we'd have to go into, although I don't have time now, and I don't in the memoir yet go into it, but what is life actually like for those who serve it, and what is life like on death row? But none of this is in a vacuum. The question is, which more nearly approaches justice? Which system more nearly approaches a just system? And it's not perfect. And so my focus, just to finish this game sport part of it, my focus, I teach substantive criminal law, which is the game of criminal law, which is, let's assume we can execute the moves that we choose. What should the moves be?
With every piece of resource, and you have all the right resources.
In a realistically perfect world, how should we define the crimes? What should murder be composed of? An intent or depraved indifference, which causes the death of an innocent victim, where there's no self-defense, there's no insanity, there's no extreme emotional disturbance. These are all moves in the game. And so my focus is upon the substance of the criminal law. And in the death penalty context, there are a number of reforms that can and should be made. Most opponents focus on the reforms of the sport, the process. I focus on the reforms in the game, the different ways that we presently define the death penalty eligible killings. Not the ways that we necessarily detect or prosecute them, but the way that we define them at the legislative level. And that's where the guys helped me in my 12 years inside Lorton enormously. They helped me with redefinitions. They helped me to understand that many whom we include as among the worst of the worst of the worst don't belong there, and many whom we exclude as not bad enough do belong there.
Well, thank you so much for your time. Once again, this is Lauren Whiting, reporting for Media Reporter at New York Law School. And as I mentioned earlier, Professor Blecker's new Kindle single is available on Amazon.com to download now and read through and learn more about the death penalty and Professor Blecker's plight, if you will, on the death penalty to try to get it clarified and the game played better of the death penalty. Thank you. Yeah, we were like probably a solid 10 minutes over.
Oh, we did?
Yeah. I tried to interrupt you about your time.